The Art of Clear Thinking, How to Make a Better Decision in Life. Brought to you by Hyptoria.
In the bustling marketplace of ideas that surrounds us daily, we witness a curious phenomenon. People argue passionately about politics, religion, and life's great questions, yet rarely pause to examine the very tools they use to reach their conclusions. We accept the most peculiar beliefs simply because someone in authority proclaims them, while rejecting obvious truths because they challenge our comfortable assumptions. This book is an invitation to step back from the noise and examine something far more fundamental: how we think, not what we think, but the very machinery of thought itself. For just as a carpenter must master his tools before crafting a fine table, so must we understand the instruments of reasoning before we can hope to construct sound arguments and reach reliable conclusions. Consider this. Every day, you make hundreds of decisions based on reasoning. You decide whether to trust a friend based on past behavior, whether to believe a news story based on its source, whether to take an umbrella based on the morning sky. Yet, how often do you examine the mental processes that lead to these conclusions? How confident are you that your reasoning is sound? The stakes are higher than you might think. Poor reasoning has led nations to war, investors to ruin, and individuals to waste their precious years pursuing impossible dreams or fleeing from achievable ones. But clear thinking, that is the key that unlocks doors you never knew existed. 1. The architecture of thought. What is reasoning, really? Imagine your mind as a vast workshop filled with raw materials, experiences, memories, observations, and half-formed ideas scattered about like lumber and nails. Reasoning is the process by which you take these raw materials and construct something useful: a decision, a belief, a plan of action. But here's the remarkable thing. Most people have been using these mental tools their entire lives without ever learning how they work. It's as if you've been driving a car for decades without understanding what happens when you press the accelerator or turn the wheel. The car moves, yes, but imagine how much better a driver you'd be if you understood the engine. Stewart, a philosopher of keen insight, once observed that reason is the power by which we distinguish truth from falsehood and right from wrong. More than that, it's the faculty that enables us to combine means for achieving particular ends. In essence, reasoning is how we navigate from where we are to where we want to be, using the stepping stones of logic. The 4 pillars of clear thought. Every act of reasoning, whether simple or complex, rests upon 4 fundamental processes. Think of them as the 4 pillars supporting the temple of human understanding. The first pillar, abstraction. This is your mind's ability to isolate a single quality from the chaos of experience. When you see a lion and extract the concept of strength from all its other qualities, its golden mane, sharp claws, thunderous roar, you are performing abstraction. You're taking one thread from the tapestry and examining it separately. Consider how often you do this without realizing it. You see a dozen different dogs and somehow extract the essence of loyalty from their varied behaviors. You witness several acts of kindness and distill from them the pure concept of goodness. This power to abstract is what separates human thinking from mere animal response. The second pillar, generalization. Once you've abstracted qualities, your mind performs an even more remarkable feat. It groups similar things together under common banners. This is how you build your mental filing system. All those 4-legged barking creatures get filed under dog. All those actions that help others without expectation of reward get categorized as kindness. But here lies both the power and the danger of generalization. When done well, it allows you to make sense of an infinite world by organizing it into manageable categories. When done poorly, it leads to the crude stereotypes and hasty judgments that poison human relations. The third pillar, judgment. Now comes the moment when your mind compares 2 concepts and declares their relationship. This animal is a dog. That action was kind. This argument is weak. Judaism is where the rubber meets the road, in thinking, where you commit to a position based on your analysis. Without judgment, you would be paralyzed by infinite possibilities. With poor judgment, you stumble through life, making one mistake after another. But with sound judgment, that is the beginning of wisdom. The fourth pillar, reasoning proper. This is the capstone that crowns the other three. Here, your mind compares two objects not directly, but through their relationship to a third. If all mammals are animals, and horses are mammals, then horses must be animals. This triangular dance of logic is what allows human beings to discover truths they've never directly observed.
The raw materials of thought.
Before you can reason well, you must have something to reason with. The quality of your conclusions can never exceed the quality of your premises, just as the strength of a chain cannot exceed its weakest link. This is why careful observation matters so much. Every fuzzy perception, every half-remembered fact, every second-hand piece of information that enters your mental warehouse becomes potential building material for future arguments. If you're careless about what you let in, you'll be constructing castles on foundations of sand. The wise person, therefore, approaches new information like a careful merchant, examining goods before purchase. Is this source reliable? Have I observed this myself, or am I taking someone else's word? What evidence supports this claim? These questions, asked habitually, become the difference between wisdom and folly.
2. The alchemy of understanding.
From chaos to concepts. Watch a child encountering the world for the first time, and you'll witness one of nature's most remarkable processes, the birth of concepts. The child sees a furry creature that barks and wags its tail, the family dog. Later, a neighbor's different-looking animal displays similar behaviors. Gradually, through countless encounters, the child's mind performs its quiet magic, extracting the essence of dogness from all these varied experiences. This process, seemingly simple, is actually one of the most sophisticated operations your mind performs. You're not just collecting examples like a stamp collector. You're discovering the invisible threads that connect seemingly different things. You're learning that beneath the surface diversity of the world lie deeper patterns and truths. But here's where many people stumble. They stop too soon in this process. They form rough, hasty concepts based on limited experience, and then treat these as absolute truth. The person who meets a few dishonest salespeople and concludes that all salespeople are liars has committed a grave error in concept formation. The traveler who visits one bad restaurant in a foreign country and declares the entire cuisine inferior has fallen into the same trap. The dance of comparison and analysis. Your mind doesn't work in isolation. It's constantly comparing, contrasting, and categorizing. When you encounter something new, your mental machinery immediately begins asking, what is this like? How does it differ from what I already know? Where does it fit in my understanding of the world? This process happens so automatically that you rarely notice it, yet it shapes every moment of conscious experience. The politician giving a speech reminds you somehow of your college professor. Haps. It's the gestures, or the rhythm of speech, or some indefinable quality of presence. Your mind has performed a lightning-fast comparison across decades of memory to make that connection. The key to improving your thinking is to make this unconscious process more deliberate. Instead of letting your mind leap to quick comparisons, slow down and examine them. What exactly is similar? What is different? Are the similarities superficial or deep? This careful analysis is what separates the thoughtful person from the merely reactive one. The synthesis. Building mental cathedrals. Once you've broken down complex experiences into their component parts, your mind faces its greatest challenge, putting them back together into something more powerful than the sum of its parts. This is synthesis, the mental alchemy that transforms scattered observations into genuine understanding. Think of how a historian approaches the past. They don't simply collect facts like a vacuum cleaner. They look for patterns, connections, causes, and effects. They take thousands of isolated events and weave them into narratives that help us understand not just what happened, but why it happened and what it means for the future. You do the same thing in your daily life, though perhaps less consciously. You take your observations of a person's behavior, their words, their choices, and synthesize them into your understanding of their character. You combine your knowledge of economics, politics, and human nature to form opinions about social policies. You integrate your experience, values, and hopes to make major life decisions. The quality of your synthesis determines the quality of your life. Synthesize carelessly, and you'll misunderstand people, make poor decisions, and miss opportunities. But learn to synthesize skillfully, and you'll see patterns others miss, anticipate consequences others ignore, and find solutions others overlook.
3. The building blocks of arguments. Words as tools and weapons.
Every carpenter knows that the quality of the finished product depends entirely on the materials used. The same principle applies to reasoning. The precision of your thinking is limited by the precision of your terms. Yet most people use words as casually as they might use any tool lying around the workshop, rarely stopping to examine whether the tool is fit for the job. Consider the word freedom. A political revolutionary uses it to justify overthrowing a government. A parent uses it to describe why they won't control their teenagers' choices. A businessman uses it to argue against regulation. Are they all talking about the same thing? Of course not. They're using one word to describe entirely different concepts, and the result is confusion masquerading as debate.
This matters more than you might think. When terms are unclear, reasoning becomes impossible. You might as well try to build a house with pieces that don't fit together.
The foundation shifts, the walls don't align, and the whole structure eventually collapses.
The spectrum of meaning.
Terms exist along several important dimensions that affect how we can use them in reasoning. Understanding these dimensions is like learning the different weights and strengths of building materials. Essential knowledge for anyone who wants to construct something that will stand.
Singular versus general terms.
Some terms point to unique, specific things. The President of the United States.
My childhood home.
The book you're reading right now. These singular terms have the virtue of precision. Everyone knows exactly what you're referring to. But they also have limitations. You can't use them to make broad statements about the world. General terms, by contrast, apply to whole classes of things. Presidents, homes, books. These terms sacrifice precision for scope. When you say politicians are corrupt, you're making a claim about an entire category, not just one individual. This gives your statement broader implications, but also makes it more vulnerable to counterexamples. Concrete versus abstract terms. Concrete terms refer to things you can experience directly. A horse, a mountain, a thunderstorm. Abstract terms refer to qualities or ideas that exist only in the mind. Justice, beauty, courage. Both types are necessary for human thought, but they require different kinds of careful handling. The danger with concrete terms is that people sometimes assume their direct experience is more universal than it actually is. The danger with abstract terms is that people use them as if they refer to concrete things, leading to endless confusion. How many arguments about justice or fairness are really just arguments about the meaning of these abstract terms? The architecture of classification. Your mind naturally organizes terms into hierarchies, like a vast filing system with categories, subcategories, and sub-subcategories. Understanding this mental architecture is crucial for clear thinking because it determines what kinds of logical moves are valid. At the top of any hierarchy are the broadest terms: aim, existence, reality. These terms include everything but tell you almost nothing specific. At the bottom are the most specific terms: individual people, particular objects, unique events. These terms tell you a great deal about one thing, but nothing about anything else. The middle levels are where most useful thinking happens. Here you find terms like mamo, democracy, ba, friendship, broad enough to apply to many cases, specific enough to carry real meaning. Learning to navigate these middle levels skillfully is one of the most important intellectual abilities you can develop. Consider how this works in practice. When you say, Socrates is mortal, you're drawing on a hierarchy that includes Socrates, specific individual. Species. Mammal, broader category. Animal, even broader. And living thing, very broad indeed. The logical force of the statement depends on this hierarchical structure being clear and consistent. 4. The art of making claims. When thoughts become declarations. There comes a moment in every train of thought when the mind stops gathering and analyzing and commits to a position. This is the birth of a proposition, a declarative statement that something is or isn't the case. The rose is red. All men are mortal. This plan will fail. Each of these represents a mind taking a stand, drawing a line in the sand of uncertainty. The ability to form clear, definite propositions is what separates serious thinking from mere mental wandering. It's the difference between someone who endlessly turns problems over in their mind and someone who reaches conclusions and acts on them. Yet this very strength can become a weakness if you don't understand how propositions work and when they're justified. The anatomy of a claim. Every proposition has three essential parts, like the foundation, walls, and roof of a house. Miss any one of them, and the whole structure becomes unstable. The subject. This is what you're talking about, the focus of your claim. It might be a specific person, Napoleon, a group, politicians, or an abstract concept, justice. The subject sets the boundaries of what your proposition covers. The predicate. This is what you're claiming about the subject, the quality, characteristic, or relationship you're asserting. Is mortal or corrupt. Requires wisdom. These predicates attach something to the subject. The copula. This is the bridge that connects subject and predicate, usually some form of the verb, to be. It seems like a small thing, but this little word carries enormous logical weight. It's what transforms a mere collection of terms into an actual claim about reality. Understanding this structure helps you see through many confused arguments. Often, when people seem to be disagreeing about facts, they're actually using different subjects or predicates while thinking they're talking about the same thing. The universe of possibilities. Propositions come in varieties as different as the tools in a craftsman's workshop, each suited for different types of intellectual work. Categorical propositions. These make straight, unqualified statements about the world. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Courage is a virtue. This book contains wisdom. They have the virtue of clarity and the vice of rigidity. They leave no room for exceptions or special circumstances. Hypothetically, propositions. These make claims about what would be true under certain conditions. If it rains, the picnic will be canceled. If you study hard, you'll pass the exam. If the government raises taxes, investment will decline. They're more flexible than categorical propositions, but also more slippery. The whole claim rests on whether the condition is actually met. Disjunctive propositions. These present alternatives. Either we act now, or we face disaster later. The solution is either very simple or impossibly complex. You're either part of the solution or part of the problem. They force choices and eliminate middle ground, which can be either clarifying or oversimplifying. The question of scope. One of the most critical distinctions in propositions is between universal and particular claims. This difference has sparked more confusion, more pointless arguments, and more tragic misunderstandings than perhaps any other aspect of human reasoning. Universal propositions make claims about entire classes. All politicians are corrupt. No good deed goes unpunished. Every action has consequences. The appeal of such statements is obvious. They seem to capture profound truths about the world, but they're also extraordinarily vulnerable. A single counterexample can demolish a universal claim completely. Particular propositions are more modest. Some politicians are corrupt. Many good deeds go unpunished. Most actions have unintended consequences. They sacrifice the rhetorical power of universal claims for the safety of qualified truth. They're harder to refute, but also less satisfying to those who crave certainty. The wise person learns to recognize when universal language is being used carelessly. When someone says, "Everyone knows that," or "It's obvious that," or "Any fool can see that," these are warning signs. The speaker may be overreaching, claiming more certainty than the evidence supports. 5. The logic of discovery. Immediate insights. Sometimes, reasoning feels like solving a jigsaw puzzle. You can see how the pieces fit together almost immediately. You observe that all swans you've encountered are white, and you immediately infer that the next swan you see will also be white. You know that John is taller than Mary, and Mary is taller than Susan, and you instantly conclude that John is taller than Susan. This is immediate reasoning, drawing conclusions directly from what you already know, without meeting elaborate chains of argument. These immediate inferences might seem almost trivial, but they form the foundation of all more complex reasoning. They're like the basic arithmetic that underlies advanced mathematics. Simple in themselves, but essential for everything that follows. The key to immediate reasoning is recognizing the logical relationships between propositions. Some relationships are so tight that once you accept one proposition, you're logically committed to accepting another. If you believe that all mammals are animals, you must also believe that some animals are mammals. The second follows inevitably from the first. The dance of opposition. One of the most useful forms of immediate reasoning involves understanding how different types of propositions relate to each other, particularly when they seem to contradict. This is like learning the rules of a complex dance. Once you know the steps, you can move gracefully through even the most intricate logical choreography. Consider 4 basic types of statements. All politicians are honest. Universal positive. No politicians are honest. Universal negative. Some politicians are honest. Particular positive. Some politicians are not honest. Particular negative. These 4 statements form a logical square, with each corner related to the others in precise ways. If you know the truth value of any one corner, you can often determine the truth values of the others through pure logic, without needing any additional facts about politicians or honesty. This might seem like an abstract game, but it has immediate practical applications. When someone makes a sweeping universal claim, all modern art is meaningless, or no politician can be trusted, you can use these logical relationships to test the claim. If you can find even one counterexample, you've disproven the universal negative and proven the corresponding particular positive. The art of conversion. Another powerful form of immediate reasoning involves converting propositions, flipping the subject and predicate to see if the resulting statement is also true. This technique can reveal hidden assumptions and test the logical structure of arguments. For example, if all roses are flowers is true, can we also say that all flowers are roses? Obviously not. The second statement is much stronger than the first. But we can say that some flowers are roses, which is a weaker but valid conversion. This process of conversion helps you recognize when arguments are trying to slip in unjustified assumptions. Politicians and advertisers are particularly fond of invalid conversions. They might argue that all successful people use our product, which might be true, while implying that all people who use our product become successful, which doesn't follow at all. 6. Building from the ground up. The art of inductive discovery. Imagine yourself as an intellectual detective, gathering clues from the world around you and slowly building a case for some general truth. This is inductive reasoning, the process of moving from specific observations to broad conclusions, from the known to the unknown, from the particular to the universal. Unlike deduction, which feels like unfolding what's already contained in your premises, induction feels like genuine discovery. You're not just rearranging existing knowledge, you're creating new knowledge, making leaps beyond what you've directly observed. Consider how this works in practice. You notice that every time you drop an object, it falls toward the ground. After hundreds of such observations, you begin to suspect a pattern. You formulate a hypothesis. All objects fall and dropped. This isn't just a summary of what you've seen, it's a prediction about what you haven't yet observed. You're betting that the future will resemble the past, that unobserved cases will follow the same pattern as observed ones. This leap from the observed to the unobserved is both the glory and the peril of inductive reasoning. It's what allows human beings to learn from experience and plan for the future. But it's also what leads us astray when we generalize too quickly or ignore important exceptions. The 4-step dance of discovery. Inductive reasoning follows a natural rhythm, like a dance with 4 distinct movements. Understanding this rhythm can help you become more skilled at learning from experience and less likely to be deceived by false patterns. Step 1. Careful observation. Everything begins with paying attention to the world around you. But this isn't passive reception. It's active, focused, systematic observation. You're not just letting experiences wash over you. You're deliberately seeking out patterns and collecting evidence. The quality of your observations determines the quality of your eventual conclusions. Sloppy observation leads to false patterns. Biased observation leads to skewed conclusions. Insufficient observation leads to hasty generalizations, but careful, systematic observation, that's the foundation of genuine wisdom.
Step 2. Hypothesis formation. This is where the magic happens. Your mind looks at the accumulated observations and suddenly sees a possible pattern.
Maybe all swans are white. Perhaps warm weather causes more aggressive behavior. Could it be that companies with happy employees are more profitable? This moment of hypothesis formation is often mysterious, even to the person experiencing it. The pattern just seems to emerge from the data, like a hidden picture becoming visible in an optical illusion. Sometimes the hypothesis comes in a flash of insight. Sometimes it emerges gradually through patient reflection. Step 3. Deductive testing. Here's where induction and deduction join forces. You take your hypothesis and ask, if this pattern is real, what else should I expect to observe? Then you go looking for those predicted observations. If your hypothesis is correct, you should find them. If not, you need to revise or abandon your theory.
This step is crucial because it protects you from seeing patterns that aren't really there. The human mind is remarkably good at finding patterns, sometimes too good. We see faces in clouds, conspiracy in coincidence, and meaning in randomness. Only by making specific predictions and testing them can we distinguish real patterns from imaginary ones. Step 4. Verification. If your predictions keep coming true across a wide range of tests, your confidence in the hypothesis grows. You begin to treat it not just as a possibility, but as a reliable truth about the world. Your hypothesis graduates to become a theory, a trusted tool for understanding and predicting future events. But verification is never complete. There's always the possibility that the next observation will contradict your theory, forcing you to revise or abandon it. This uncertainty might seem like a weakness, but it's actually a strength. It keeps you humble, open to new evidence, willing to change your mind when reality contradicts your expectations. The problem of the black swan. For centuries, Europeans observed swans and reached what seemed like an obvious conclusion. All swans are white. The evidence was overwhelming. Thousands of white swans, and not a single exception. Then Europeans reached Australia and discovered black swans. One observation destroyed a generalization based on countless previous observations. This story illustrates the fundamental challenge of inductive reasoning. No amount of confirmatory evidence can prove a universal generalization with absolute certainty. You can never be sure you've seen enough cases to justify your conclusion. The next observation might always be the one that breaks the pattern. This doesn't mean inductive reasoning is worthless, quite the opposite. It means you need to approach it with appropriate humility. Be confident in your conclusions, but not so confident that you ignore contradictory evidence. Build your generalizations carefully, but hold them lightly. Be prepared to revise your beliefs when reality demands it. The wise person treats inductive conclusions as working hypotheses rather than eternal truths. They're tools for understanding and navigating the world, not fixed dogmas to be defended at all costs. When new evidence emerges, the wise person asks, not, how can I preserve my existing beliefs? What do I need to believe now to align with reality? 7. The laboratory of the mind. Turning observations into understanding. Every day, your mind performs experiments, not with test tubes and microscopes, but with ideas and possibilities. You observe patterns in human behavior and wonder what causes them. You notice correlations between events and ask whether one might cause the other. You see unexpected outcomes and try to figure out what went wrong with your predictions. This experimental mindset, this willingness to form hypotheses and test them against reality, is one of the most powerful tools human beings possess. Yet many people use it unconsciously, if at all. They form beliefs based on limited experience and then defend those beliefs against all contrary evidence, rather than treating them as hypotheses to be tested. Learning to think experimentally transforms both your understanding of the world and your ability to navigate it successfully. Instead of being trapped by your initial impressions, you become a lifelong learner, constantly refining your understanding as new evidence emerges. The birth of hypotheses. Where do hypotheses come from? This question has puzzled philosophers for centuries, and with good reason.
Hypotheses aren't simply summaries of what you've already observed. They're creative leaps beyond the evidence, attempts to explain not just what you've seen, but what you haven't yet seen.
Sometimes a hypothesis emerges gradually through careful analysis. You notice that successful businesses share certain characteristics, and slowly you develop a theory about what makes businesses succeed.
You observe that certain teaching methods produce better learning outcomes, and eventually you formulate principles of effective education.
But sometimes hypotheses arrive like bolts of lightning, sudden insights that seem to come from nowhere. The mathematician suddenly sees the solution to a problem that has puzzled them for months. The scientist has a flash of inspiration about why an experiment keeps failing. The historian realizes that seemingly unrelated events might actually be connected by a hidden pattern. These moments of insight often feel mysterious, even magical. But they're not random. They typically come to minds that have been thoroughly saturated with relevant information, minds that have been wrestling with a problem long enough for the subconscious to work its mysterious magic. As the saying goes, chance favors the prepared mind.
Testing ideas against reality. The moment you have a hypothesis, you face a crucial choice. You can either fall in love with it or treat it as a useful tool to be tested.
Those who fall in love with their hypotheses become dogmatists, defending their ideas against all evidence to the contrary. Those who treat hypotheses as tools become scientists, willing to abandon even their most cherished theories when reality demands it. Testing a hypothesis requires turning it into specific, testable predictions. If your theory about business success is correct, what should you observe when you examine successful companies? If your hypothesis about human motivation is accurate, how should people behave in particular situations? If your explanation of historical events is valid, what evidence should you be able to find? This process of turning vague ideas into testable predictions is often more difficult than it seems. It forces you to be precise about what you actually believe and what you're willing to stake your reputation on. It's easy to hold fuzzy, untestable beliefs that can never be proven wrong. It's harder to formulate clear hypotheses that make their own destruction possible. But this vulnerability to disconfirmation is actually a strength, not a weakness. Ideas that can't be tested can't be trusted. Hypotheses that make no testable predictions explain nothing and predict nothing. Only by risking being wrong can you hope to be genuinely right. The danger of confirmation bias. Human beings have a natural tendency to seek out evidence that confirms their existing beliefs, while ignoring or dismissing evidence that contradicts them. This confirmation bias is so powerful and so universal that it affects even trained scientists when they're not being careful. The danger is obvious. If you only look for confirming evidence, you'll find it even when your hypothesis is wrong. Every false theory can find some supporting evidence if you're selective enough about what you count. Every prejudice can be confirmed if you pay attention only to cases that support it, while ignoring counterexamples. The antidote to confirmation bias is actively seeking out disconfirming evidence. Instead of asking, "What evidence supports my hypothesis?" ask, "What evidence would prove my hypothesis wrong?" Instead of looking for cases that fit your theory, look for cases that challenge it. Instead of surrounding yourself with people who agree with you, seek out intelligent critics who can point out flaws in your reasoning. This doesn't mean becoming a skeptic who refuses to believe anything. It means becoming a careful thinker who distinguishes between what you want to be true and what the evidence actually supports. It means being harder on your own ideas than you are on other people's, because your own ideas are the ones most likely to deceive you. When hypotheses become theories. Not all hypotheses survive testing. Many are quickly discarded when they fail to make accurate predictions. Some are modified and refined in light of new evidence, but a few, the special ones, keep making accurate predictions across a wide range of tests. These graduates become theories. A theory isn't just a guess or a speculation. It's a hypothesis that has proven its worth through repeated testing. It's a reliable tool for understanding and predicting aspects of the world. Gravity isn't just a theory. It's a theory in the strongest sense. A well-tested explanation that has earned our confidence through centuries of successful predictions. But even the best theories aren't final truths. They're our current best understanding, subject to revision or replacement if better explanations emerge. The history of science is littered with discarded theories that once seemed unshakable. This doesn't mean science is unreliable. It means science is self-correcting, always moving toward better approximations of truth. The same principle applies to your personal theories about how the world works. Your understanding of human nature, your theories about what makes relationships successful, your beliefs about effective parenting or leadership. These should all be held as working hypotheses, valuable tools that have served you well, but might need revision as you gain more experience. 8. The engine of logical certainty. From the general to the particular. If inductive reasoning is like climbing a mountain, starting from the valley of particular observations and ascending to the peaks of general principles, then deductive reasoning is like descending that same mountain. You begin with broad principles and work your way down to specific conclusions. This downward movement has a different feel from inductive reasoning. Instead of the uncertainty and creativity of induction, deduction offers the satisfaction of logical necessity. When done correctly, the conclusion follows inevitably from the premises. There's no leap of faith, no creative insight required, just the steady application of logical principles. Consider this classic example. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Once you accept the first two statements, the conclusion is inescapable. You can't consistently believe the premises and deny the conclusion without contradicting yourself. This is the power of deductive reasoning. It transforms uncertainty into certainty, possibility into necessity. The architecture of certainty. Deductive reasoning rests on a simple but profound principle. Whatever is true of the whole must be true of its parts. If all mammals are warm-blooded, then this particular mammal, your pet dog, must also be warm-blooded. If all valid arguments preserve truth from premises to conclusion, then this particular valid argument must also preserve truth. This principle might seem obvious, but it underlies every piece of mathematical reasoning, every logical argument, every scientific law applied to particular cases. It's what allows you to trust that the same physical laws that govern laboratory experiments also govern the natural world. It's what permits judges to apply general legal principles to specific cases. The beauty of deductive reasoning is its transparency. Every step can be examined and verified. The logic is laid bare for all to see. If you disagree with a deductive conclusion, you must either challenge the premises or find an error in the logical steps. There's no room for vague objections or appeals to emotion. The sources of general principles. But where do the general principles come from? Deductive reasoning is only as strong as the premises it starts with, and those premises must come from somewhere. Some principles seem to be built into the very structure of thought itself. Nothing can both be and not be at the same time. Appears to be a necessary truth, not something we learn from experience, but something that makes experience possible. Mathematical truths like 2 + 2 = 4 seem similarly foundational. Other principles come from inductive reasoning, the careful accumulation and generalization of particular observations. The principle that all metals expand when heated emerged from countless experiments and observations. The generalization that supply and demand affect prices was built up from numerous economic observations. Still, other principles are hypothetical, assumed for the sake of argument, or adopted as working assumptions. If we assume that people act rationally to maximize their own interests, then we can predict. This type of reasoning is common in economics, game theory, and other social sciences, where the fundamental principles are not as well established as in physics or mathematics. The syllogism, logic made visible. The syllogism is deductive reasoning in its purest form, a three-part argument that moves from two premises to a conclusion with perfect logical transparency. It's the basic unit of logical thought, the atom from which all more complex reasoning is built. Every valid syllogism follows the same pattern: a major premise that states a general principle, a minor premise that identifies a particular case, and a conclusion that applies the general principle to that particular case. All birds have feathers. Robins are birds. Therefore, robins have feathers. The beauty of the syllogism is that its validity depends entirely on its logical structure, not on the truth of its content. You can have a perfectly valid syllogism with false premises. All dogs are blue. Rover is a dog. Therefore, Rover is blue. The reasoning is valid, even though the conclusion is false, because the conclusion follows logically from the premises. This separation of validity from truth is one of the most important distinctions in logic. An argument can be valid but unsound if the premises are false, or invalid but accidentally true if the conclusion happens to be correct despite flawed reasoning. Learning to recognize these distinctions helps you evaluate arguments more carefully and avoid being persuaded by clever hyphen-sounding but logically flawed reasoning. The rules of valid reasoning. Valid syllogisms must follow certain rules, like grammatical rules for constructing proper sentences. These rules aren't arbitrary conventions. They're requirements for preserving truth from premises to conclusion. The most fundamental rule is that there must be exactly 3 terms in the syllogism, no more and no fewer. If you have 4 terms, you're actually making 2 different arguments. If you have only 2 terms, you're not really reasoning at all, just restating the same information in different words. Another crucial rule is that the middle term, the one that appears in both premises but not in the conclusion, must be distributed, used in its full extent, at least once. This ensures that there's actually a logical connection between the major and minor premises. Violating this rule creates the famous fallacy of the undistributed middle. Consider this flawed reasoning. All cats are animals. All dogs are animals. Therefore, all cats are dogs. The middle term, animals, isn't properly distributed. It doesn't connect cats and dogs in any meaningful way. Both cats and dogs might be animals, but that doesn't make them the same thing. It's like saying that because both apples and oranges are fruits, apples must be oranges. Other rules govern the relationship between premises and conclusion. You can't have 2 negative premises. They tell you what things aren't, but not what they are. If one premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative too. You can't claim more in the conclusion than what's warranted by the premises. These rules might seem technical and abstract, but they protect you from some of the most common errors in everyday reasoning. Master these principles, and you'll be amazed how often you spot flawed arguments that once seemed convincing. 9. Beyond simple syllogisms. When reality refuses simple categories, the world rarely cooperates with our desire for simple, categorical statements. Life is messy, full of conditions, alternatives, and exceptions. Pure categorical reasoning, the kind that deals in absolutes like all and none, can handle only a fraction of the arguments we encounter in daily life. This is where more sophisticated forms of reasoning become essential. Instead of limiting ourselves to statements like, all politicians are corrupt, we need tools for handling, if politicians face real accountability, then corruption decreases. And either we reform the system or we accept continued corruption. These more complex forms of reasoning mirror the complexity of real-world decision-making. They acknowledge uncertainty, consider alternatives, and deal with conditional relationships. They're less elegant than simple syllogisms, but far more useful for navigating actual human problems. The logic of conditions. Hypothetically, reasoning deals with if-then relationships, the vast network of conditional connections that shape our world. If you study hard, then you'll likely pass the exam. If interest rates rise, then borrowing becomes more expensive. If you exercise regularly, then your health will probably improve. These conditional relationships are everywhere in human reasoning, yet they're surprisingly tricky to handle correctly. The most common error is affirming the consequent, assuming that because the then part is true, the if part must also be true. For example, if it's raining, then the streets are wet. The streets are wet. Therefore, it must be raining. This reasoning is invalid because wet streets could have other causes: a burst water pipe, street cleaning, melting snow. The condition if it's raining is sufficient to make the streets wet, but it's not necessary. Other conditions could produce the same result. The valid forms of hypothetical reasoning are more limited but more reliable. If you accept a conditional statement and then observe that the condition is met, you can safely conclude that the consequence follows. If you observe that the consequence doesn't occur, you can safely conclude that the condition wasn't met. These valid patterns help you navigate conditional relationships without falling into logical traps. The logic of alternatives. Sometimes life forces choices between mutually exclusive alternatives. You can vacation in the mountains or at the beach, but not both. A political candidate will either win or lose the election. A business strategy will either succeed or fail. These either-or situations call for disjunctive reasoning. The basic principle of disjunctive reasoning is straightforward. If you must choose between alternatives and you rule out all but one, then that one must be correct. This principle underlies much of diagnostic reasoning in medicine, troubleshooting in engineering, and detective work in criminal investigation. But disjunctive reasoning has hidden complications. The most important is ensuring that you've actually identified all the relevant alternatives. If you're choosing between vacation destinations and consider only mountains and beach, you might miss the perfect city break that would suit you better. If you think a business strategy must either succeed completely or fail completely, you might miss the partial success that's actually the most likely outcome. Another complication is determining whether the alternatives are truly mutually exclusive. Can't a business strategy partially succeed? Might a candidate tie rather than win or lose? Could you vacation in a mountain town near a lake, combining both alternatives? Real-world situations often resist meet either-or categorization. The trap of false dilemmas. One of the most manipulative forms of bad reasoning is the false dilemma, presenting two stark alternatives when many more options actually exist. Politicians are masters of this technique. Either you support this bill or you don't care about working families. Advertisers use it too. Either you buy our premium service or you settle for inferior quality. The false dilemma works by limiting your perceived options. Once you accept that only two choices exist, and one of them is clearly unacceptable, the other choice seems inevitable. But the whole argument crumbles once you recognize that other alternatives exist. Learning to spot false dilemmas requires asking a simple question. Are these really the only two options? Often, a few minutes of creative thinking reveals numerous alternatives that weren't initially considered. The middle ground that seemed to disappear might actually be the most reasonable position. The compromise solution that nobody mentioned might satisfy everyone's core concerns. 10. The art of drawing parallels when similarity suggests truth. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. We can't help but notice similarities and assume they carry meaning. When we see two situations that seem alike in some ways, we naturally expect them to be alike in other ways too. This tendency toward analogical reasoning is both one of our greatest intellectual strengths and one of our most dangerous weaknesses. At its best, reasoning by analogy allows us to learn from experience and apply insights from familiar situations to unfamiliar ones. A doctor diagnosing a new patient draws on similarities to cases she's seen before. A parent dealing with a difficult teenager remembers what worked with an older sibling. A business leader facing a crisis looks for parallels in history to guide his decisions. But analogical reasoning can also mislead us badly. Superficial similarities might mask deep differences. What worked in one context might fail miserably in another. The pattern we think we see might be pure coincidence, or we might be forcing connections that don't really exist. The structure of analogical arguments. Every analogical argument has the same basic structure. Here are two situations that are similar in ways X, Y, and Z. Since situation A has property P, situation B probably has property P as well. The strength of the argument depends on how relevant the similarities are and how comprehensive they are. Consider this analogical argument. Free markets work well for distributing goods like cars and computers. Education is also a good that people value. Therefore, free markets would probably work well for distributing education too. The argument rests on the similarity between education and other goods. But is that similarity deep enough to support the conclusion? To evaluate this argument, you'd need to ask, in what ways is education similar to cars and computers? In what ways is it different? Are the similarities relevant to the question of whether market distribution works well? Do the differences matter more than the similarities? Education might be similar to other goods in that people value it and are willing to pay for it. But it might be different in crucial ways. Its effects might be harder to measure. Its benefits might extend beyond the immediate purchaser, or information asymmetries might make market failures more likely. The power and peril of historical analogies. Historical analogies hold special fascination because they seem to offer lessons from the past that can guide present decisions. This situation is just like what happened in 1930s Germany. We're repeating the mistakes of the Vietnam War. 1. This economic crisis resembles the Great Depression. These analogies can provide valuable insights by highlighting patterns that might otherwise go unnoticed. The person who recognizes parallels between current economic conditions and those of previous recessions might be better prepared for what's coming. The leader who sees similarities between a current conflict and historical precedents might avoid repeating past mistakes. But historical analogs are also dangerous precisely because they seem so compelling. History never repeats exactly, it only rhymes, as the saying goes. The surface similarities that make an analogy appealing might mask crucial differences that make the analogy misleading. The current situation always differs from historical precedents in countless ways. Technology has changed, social conditions have evolved, economic structures have transformed, political institutions have adapted. What worked or failed in the past might succeed or fail for entirely different reasons today. Testing the strength of analogies. The key to using analogical reasoning wisely is learning to evaluate analogies critically rather than being swept away by their intuitive appeal. This requires systematic comparison of similarities and differences, with special attention to which factors are most relevant to the conclusion you're drawing. Strong analogies rest on numerous, deep, relevant similarities between the compared situations. Weak analogies rely on superficial, irrelevant, or purely coincidental resemblances. The strongest analogies also acknowledge and account for important differences rather than ignoring them. Consider the analogy between a government and a household budget. Politicians often argue that, just like a family has to live within its means, the government should balance its budget. This analogy has intuitive appeal. Most people understand household finances and can apply that understanding to government finances. But is the analogy sound? A government differs from a household in crucial ways. It can print money. It lives indefinitely rather than for a human lifespan. It can compel payment of taxes, and its spending affects the overall economy in ways that household spending doesn't. These differences might be relevant enough to undermine the analogy's conclusion. The creative power of analogical thinking. Despite its dangers, analogical reasoning remains one of the most powerful tools for creative thinking and problem solving. Many of the greatest scientific discoveries and technological innovations have emerged from recognizing unexpected analogies between seemingly unrelated phenomena. Darwin's theory of evolution drew on Malthus's insights about population growth. The structure of the atom was understood by analogy to the solar system. Computer programming concepts borrowed metaphors from filing cabinets and desktop organization. These analogs didn't just make complex ideas easier to understand, they actually guided the discovery of new truths. The key is using analogies as springboards for further investigation rather than as final answers. When you notice an intriguing similarity between two situations, don't immediately conclude that they're the same in all important respects. Instead, use the analogy as a hypothesis to be tested. What predictions does the analogy suggest? What evidence would support or undermine it? Where might the analogy break down? This approach transforms analogical reasoning from a source of bias into a tool for discovery. Instead of being trapped by superficial similarities, you become alert to both the insights and the limitations that analogies provide. You gain the creative benefits of analogical thinking while protecting yourself from its characteristic errors. 11. The quicksands of false reasoning. When logic goes astray. Every carpenter knows that using the wrong tool can ruin the finest materials. The same principle applies to reasoning. Even brilliant minds can reach absurd conclusions when they employ faulty logical tools. Understanding these common errors, these fallacies that trap even careful thinkers, is like learning to recognize counterfeit currency. Once you know what to look for, you're much less likely to be deceived. Fallacies are seductive precisely because they mimic valid reasoning. They follow patterns that feel logical, use techniques that seem sound, and often reach conclusions that align with what we want to believe anyway. This makes them far more dangerous than obvious nonsense. which anyone can recognize and dismiss. The person who masters the recognition of fallacies gains a superpower, the ability to think clearly in a world full of confused and manipulative arguments. You become immune to many forms of deception and manipulation. More importantly, you become better at catching your own reasoning errors before they lead you astray. The foundation errors. Some fallacies attack reasoning at its very foundation by corrupting the premises from which all else flows. These are particularly insidious because they can make an entire chain of otherwise valid reasoning lead to false conclusions. Begging the question is perhaps the most fundamental of these foundation errors. It occurs when you assume the very thing you're trying to prove, often without realizing it. The argument appears to have premises and a conclusion, but the premises actually depend on accepting the conclusion. Consider this argument. We should trust the government because the authorities are reliable. Sounds reasonable until you realize that authorities are reliable is just another way of saying we should trust the government. The premise assumes what the conclusion seeks to establish. Sometimes question begging is more subtle. This book is boring because it fails to hold the reader's interest. The premise fails to hold interest is just a definition of the conclusion rather than evidence for it. To avoid begging the question, you need independent reasons for your premises, reasons that don't secretly depend on your conclusion being true. Circular reasoning is question begging's close cousin. Here, you use conclusion A to prove premise B, then use premise B to prove conclusion A. I believe this source because it's reliable, and I know it's reliable because I believe it. The reasoning goes in a circle, never touching solid ground. These circular patterns can be hard to spot when they're stretched across long arguments or complex discussions. The circle might be so large that you forget where you started by the time you complete the loop. The antidote is keeping track of your logical dependencies. What assumption does this premise rest on? What evidence supports that assumption? If you trace back far enough and find yourself where you started, you've discovered a circle. The distraction techniques. Another family of fallacies works by diverting attention from the real issue. These fallacies don't directly attack the logic of an argument. They sidestep logic entirely by changing the subject in subtle but misleading ways. The straw man is one of the most common distraction techniques. Instead of addressing your opponent's actual argument, you construct a weaker, more easily defeated version and attack that instead. It's like defeating a scarecrow and claiming victory over a real warrior. For example, if someone argues for increased education funding, the straw man response might be, "So you think we should just throw money at problems without any accountability?" This misrepresents the original position, making it easier to attack. The original argument might have included detailed accountability measures, but the straw man version ignores these to create an easier target. Red herrings work by introducing irrelevant information that pulls attention away from the main argument. Like a strong-smelling fish dragged across a trail to confuse tracking dogs, red herrings lead reasoning off course by introducing fascinating but irrelevant details. In a discussion about the effectiveness of a particular economic policy, someone might introduce a red herring by shifting focus to the personal character of the policy's supporters. How can you trust an economic plan proposed by someone who was divorced twice? The personal lives of policy advocates might be interesting, but they're irrelevant to the policy's merits. The emotional manipulations. Perhaps the most persuasive fallacies are those that bypass reasoning entirely by appealing directly to emotions. These fallacies feel compelling because they trigger powerful psychological responses, making critical thinking feel unnecessary or even callous. Appeal to fear works by suggesting that terrible consequences will follow unless you accept a particular conclusion. If we don't pass this law immediately, crime will skyrocket and our children won't be safe. The appeal bypasses careful analysis of the law's likely effects by focusing attention on frightening possibilities. Fear appeals aren't automatically fallacious. Sometimes fear is justified and should influence our decisions. The fallacy occurs when the fear is disproportionate to the actual risk, or when it's used to avoid careful analysis of alternatives. The question isn't whether the feared outcome is possible, but whether it's likely enough and serious enough to justify the proposed response. Appeal to authority exploits our natural tendency to defer to expertise and status.
Professor X believes this theory, so it must be true.
Sometimes this appeal is reasonable. Experts often know more than non-experts, but the appeal becomes fallacious when the authority isn't actually expert in the relevant field, when experts disagree among themselves, or when the appeal substitutes for rather than supplements actual evidence. The most seductive authority appeals involve people we admire for reasons unrelated to their expertise on the topic at hand. A beloved actor endorsing a political candidate or a successful business person promoting a scientific theory might carry psychological weight, but their success in other fields doesn't necessarily qualify them as authorities on the issue in question. The false precision fallacies. Some of the most sophisticated fallacies involve misusing legitimate logical techniques, hyphen application them in contexts where they don't belong, or pushing them beyond their proper limits. False dichotomy presents two alternatives as if they were the only possibilities when many more options actually exist. Either you're with us or you're against us. Either we allow complete freedom or we accept total tyranny. These stark either-or formulations can be powerful rhetorical devices, but they often obscure the middle ground where reasonable solutions might be found. Real-world problems usually offer a spectrum of possible responses, rather than just two polar opposites. Recognizing false dichotomies opens up these overlooked alternatives and often leads to more nuanced, effective solutions. Hasty generalization takes the legitimate process of inductive reasoning and rushes it to completion with insufficient evidence. After meeting a few rude people from a particular region, you conclude that everyone from that region is rude. After seeing a couple of movies from a particular director, you decide that all his films are boring. The line between reasonable generalization and hasty generalization isn't always clear, but the direction is consistent. Gather more evidence, consider more cases, account for exceptions, and remain open to revision when new information emerges. The causation confusions. Some of the most dangerous fallacies involve mistaken assumptions about cause and effect. These errors can lead to wildly misguided attempts to influence outcomes by manipulating factors that aren't actually causal. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore because of this. Assumes that because one event followed another, the first event caused the second. A new mayor takes office and crime rates drop, so the mayor's policies must have caused the reduction. A person starts taking vitamin supplements and stops getting colds, so the vitamins must be responsible. These causal inferences might be correct, but the temporal sequence alone doesn't prove causation. Crime might have been dropping already due to demographic changes. The person might have stopped getting colds because they also started washing their hands more frequently. Correlation, even when combined with temporal sequence, doesn't establish causation. Confusing correlation with causation is the broader category that includes post hoc reasoning. Ice cream sales and drowning deaths both increase in summer, but ice cream doesn't cause drowning. Both are caused by warm weather that brings people outdoors and into contact with water. The key to avoiding causation fallacies is considering alternative explanations. What else might have caused the observed effect? Might both the supposed cause and effect actually be caused by some third factor? Might the relationship be purely coincidental? Only when you've considered and ruled out these alternatives can you begin to have confidence in a causal relationship. The self-correction imperative. Understanding fallacies is valuable, but it's not enough by itself. The ultimate goal isn't to become a fallacy-spotting machine who wins arguments by identifying logical errors in other people's reasoning. The ultimate goal is to improve your own thinking and reasoning. This requires turning the lens inward and examining your own arguments for fallacious patterns. Are you begging the question by assuming what you need to prove? Are you attacking straw-man versions of opposing views? Are you appealing to emotions when you should be analyzing evidence? Are you rushing to causal conclusions based on insufficient evidence? This self-examination is often uncomfortable because it reveals the flaws in reasoning that led to conclusions you're attached to. But it's also liberating because it frees you from the burden of defending indefensible positions. When you discover that one of your beliefs rests on fallacious reasoning, you have the opportunity to either find better evidence for it or abandon it in favor of a more defensible position. The person who masters fallacy recognition becomes not just a better critic of other people's arguments, but a more honest and effective thinker. This is the true value of understanding logical errors. Not winning debates,
but pursuing truth. 12. The compass of clear thinking. Navigating the territory of thought. Throughout this journey into the architecture of reasoning, we've explored the fundamental structures that support all clear thinking. Like an explorer who has mapped a new territory, you now possess charts showing the major landmarks, the reliable paths, and the dangerous terrain to avoid. But maps are only useful if you know how to read them and apply them to actual navigation. The techniques and principles we've covered, from the formation of concepts to the detection of fallacies, are tools for thinking well, not just for thinking about thinking. Their value lies not in abstract understanding, but in practical application to the real challenges you face every day. The integration of knowledge. One of the most remarkable aspects of human reasoning is how all its various forms work together. Inductive and deductive reasoning aren't separate, competing approaches. They're complementary processes that strengthen each other. You use induction to discover general principles, then apply those principles deductively to new situations. When the deductive predictions fail, you return to inductive reasoning to refine your generalizations. Similarly, analogical reasoning doesn't replace logical analysis. It supplements it by suggesting new possibilities and connections. When you notice an analogy between two situations, you don't stop thinking. Instead, you use the analogy as a starting point for more careful analysis of similarities and differences. Even the recognition of fallacies serves the larger project of constructive reasoning. When you identify a fallacious argument, you've cleared away intellectual debris that was obscuring the real issues. This creates space for more productive forms of reasoning to operate. The practical wisdom of intellectual humility. Perhaps the most important insight from studying reasoning is how often we reason poorly, how easy it is to make mistakes, and how difficult it is to achieve genuine understanding. This recognition might initially seem discouraging, but it's actually liberating. Once you accept the limitations of human reasoning, you can work with those limitations rather than against them. Intellectual humility, the recognition that your beliefs might be wrong, your reasoning might be flawed, and your perspective might be limited, is not a weakness, but a strength. It protects you from the overconfidence that leads to terrible decisions. It keeps you open to new evidence and alternative perspectives. It makes you a more reliable partner in the collaborative search for truth. This doesn't mean becoming a paralyzed skeptic who refuses to believe anything or take any action. It means holding your beliefs with appropriate confidence, strong enough to act on, tentative enough to revise when necessary. It means distinguishing between what you know with high confidence and what you merely suspect or hope. The social dimension of reasoning. Reasoning isn't a purely individual activity. Most of our important beliefs are shaped by conversation, debate, and collaboration with others. The quality of our reasoning depends not just on our individual skills, but on our ability to participate constructively in these social processes. This social dimension makes the study of reasoning even more important. When you understand how arguments work, you can contribute more effectively to group discussions. When you can recognize fallacies, you can help keep conversations focused on productive issues. When you appreciate the complexity of most questions, you can resist the pressure to oversimplify for rhetorical effect. Good reasoning in social contexts requires additional skills beyond those needed for individual reflection. You need to be able to state opposing views fairly and charitably. You need to acknowledge the strengths and positions you disagree with. You need to change your mind gracefully when presented with better evidence or arguments. You need to separate questions of truth from questions of status or loyalty. The long view of intellectual development. Learning to reason well is not a destination, but a journey. The principles and techniques in this book provide a foundation, but expertise comes only through extensive practice in applying these tools to real problems. Every argument you encounter, every decision you face, every belief you examine, becomes an opportunity to strengthen your reasoning skills. This long-term view suggests a different approach to intellectual growth. Instead of trying to win every argument or defend every belief, focus on becoming a better thinker. Instead of seeking positions that make you feel smart or superior, seek understanding that makes you more effective. Instead of avoiding intellectual challenges that might reveal your ignorance, embrace them as opportunities to learn. The irony is that the more you study reasoning, the more aware you become of how much you don't know and how often you've been wrong in the past. But this growing awareness of ignorance is actually a sign of intellectual progress. The person who recognizes the limitations of their knowledge is much wiser than the person who imagines they have all the answers. The promise of clearer thinking. What can you expect if you take seriously the principles and practices outlined in this book? Not perfection. Human reasoning will always be limited and fallible. Not certainty. Most important questions will remain complex and contested. Not easy answers. Clear thinking often reveals that simple problems are actually complicated. What you can expect is gradual improvement in your ability to navigate intellectual challenges. You'll become better at recognizing when you have sufficient evidence for a conclusion and when you need to gather more information. You'll become more skilled at evaluating the arguments others present to you. You'll become more effective at explaining your own thinking and persuading others through reason rather than manipulation. Perhaps most importantly, you'll become more comfortable with intellectual uncertainty. Instead of feeling compelled to have strong opinions about every topic, you'll become selective about where to invest your intellectual energy. Instead of feeling threatened by challenges to your beliefs, you'll welcome them as opportunities to refine your understanding. The continuing journey. This book ends, but your development as a thinker continues. Every conversation, every decision, every belief presents an opportunity to apply what you've learned. The goal isn't to become a perfect reasoner. Such a creature doesn't exist. The goal is to become a more thoughtful, more careful, more effective thinker than you were before. The world needs people who can think clearly about complex problems, who can distinguish good evidence from bad, who can construct sound arguments and recognize flawed ones. These skills are not just personal advantages. They're contributions to the larger human project of understanding our world and making it better. As you continue this journey, remember that good reasoning is both an art and a science. It requires technical knowledge of logical principles, but also practical wisdom about when and how to apply them. It demands intellectual courage to follow evidence wherever it leads, but also intellectual humility to acknowledge when you've reached the limits of your understanding. The cultivation of clear thinking is one of the noblest human endeavors. It connects you to a tradition stretching back to the ancient philosophers who first tried to understand how the mind works, and forward to future generations who will face challenges we can't yet imagine. By joining this tradition, by committing yourself to reasoning well, you become part of humanity's ongoing quest for truth and understanding. The journey toward clearer thinking is difficult, but rewarding, challenging but enriching, endless but meaningful. May you find in it not just better answers, but better questions. May you discover not just what to think, but how to think well. And may you use these gifts not just for your own benefit, but in service of the larger human community of which you are a part. Epilogue. The responsibility of understanding. In a world awash with information, but often starved of wisdom, the ability to think clearly becomes both a personal asset and a social responsibility. Every time you choose careful analysis over hasty judgment, evidence over emotion, or nuanced understanding over simplistic certainty, you make a small but meaningful contribution to the quality of human discourse. The tools of reasoning you now possess are powerful instruments. Like all powerful tools, they can be used wisely or poorly, constructively or destructively. The choice is yours, and with it comes the obligation to use these tools in service of truth rather than mere advantage, understanding rather than mere victory, wisdom rather than mere cleverness. The adventure of clear thinking awaits. Step forward with confidence, but also with humility. Think boldly, but also carefully. Seek truth wherever it may lead, and trust that the journey itself will transform you in ways you cannot yet imagine.